Thank you for attending. This session is called Designing for Neurodiversity. So I'll just start sharing my screen now. Designing for Neurodiversity. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Helen Kane. I'm an access consultant and surveyor, and my pronouns are she, her, which means you're a safe place here. And you're also a safe place to talk about anything to do with neurodiversity. You have complete confidence here, and you can contact me afterwards if there is anything that you want to talk about. Okay, so I am an inclusive designer and an access consultant, and by background I'm a surveyor, so background in property. I specialise in neurodiversity and active travel, engagement, listening, lots of things. I'm well travelled and culturally aware. And I'm very conscious that architects are very keen on books. I've got a range of books in front of me. And if you want to contact me afterwards for references, please do so. I'll just hold them up as I go along. So here's a summary of the things we want to cover today. We're going to talk about the language of neurodiversity. I know that's quite difficult for some people to manage and to know what to say. So we'll look at that, and then we'll look at breaking the word down into neuro and diversity. And the big word around that is the senses. So we'll look at how the senses interact together and separately, just a little bit. This won't be a very technical session today because it's a lunchtime session, and the intention is to make you contemplate about multisensory design. So don't worry too much about the technical detail. Contact me afterwards if you need some more information. So then we'll talk about the dangers of using templates and averages in this subject. Everyone is different. And then just two aspects of design that impact particularly on neurodiversity. That's temperature and patterns. There are many others, but we've only got a short session today, and I want you to raise some questions. And then we'll look at project briefing for you and the language you use when you're doing that, and when to involve a specialist. Okay, so neurodiversity. PAS 6463 defines this as all types of ways humans think, move, process, and act, and others have defined it as all of us on a spectrum, all messy. To me, it's a biological fact. There are infinite variations in sensory perception, reception, processing, storage, reactions, and memory recall. None of us are the same. We're all really different. And then we go on to the word neurodivergent. And again, the PAS defines this as a brain cognitive profile that functions in ways that diverge significantly from the dominant societal standards, which they mean neurotypical. And the word typical is very difficult to apply in every sense, but in particular when everybody's different. So they need a definition. So they define that as dominant types of neurocognitive function. Okay. Don't get too hung up on the definitions though, but the big thing is that we now have a standard which defines the word neurodiverse and neurodivergent. I will also mention neurodegenerative conditions. Now, this isn't defined in the PAS because we are working to the social model of disability. And for those who don't know about that, that means that we talk about the impact of the environment on everyone rather than talking about medical situations. But just for your information, neurodegenerative is a degeneration of nerve cells in the brain or peripheral nervous system where you lose function over time, such as, and that's the way we describe conditions when we try to keep in the social model, such as dementia and Parkinson's. So here we are, the social model declares that society creates the barriers which disable people. They're in the environment, and the medical model assumes that people are disabled by their differences or impairments. They're not. it's the environment that does them. So today I will try and keep out of the medical model, but I must say that I will talk about lived experience, my own lived experience, and that will of course go into talking about the way my brain works and certain things happen. And then I'll skip out of that once I've talked to you about it so that you're aware of some of the differences. So very quickly, because it's a lunchtime session and you've got a very heavy schedule of events here going on, neuro. Okay, so 90% of what we do is subconscious. The brain, very, very simply, is made up of the core elements right in the center, the reptilian complex, and all the sensory signals come in there, and that's where we get our gut reaction, our fight or flight reaction. Okay, and then from there outwards, from the center, all the messages are processed in an ever more complex pattern. And there are elements where we assess risk, we apply logic, and the neocortex has 3 billion signals a second going on. And they don't all connect from the neocortex right back to the reptilian complex until we're about age 24. So that's when the real logical decisions with experience come through. Okay, obviously the brain is connected to the body. It taps right into the spinal column, as you can see there. So we don't consider the brain and the body separately. But now, for the first time, we have some regulations which build upon the physical barriers in the environment from Approved Document M and BS 8300 2018 1 and 2 for buildings and external environments. So this is the most important element of understanding how the brain works. It's a fight or flight reaction. This is where the initial message comes in. And if we are anxious or stressed or scared, these are the reactions that will happen. Our pupils dilate. It's as if a dinosaur is about to attack us. It's as evolutionary as that. Our mouth will get dry. We'll try and empty the contents of our stomach so we can run. We will be tense in our body. Breathing changes. We sweat. I'm sure you've all experienced that before. So it's called fight or flight, often called fight, flight, or freeze too. Okay, so this is the point I go into a bit of the medical model. I'm going to talk about neurodiversity, and there is an expression we use in disability called nothing about us without us. This has been drawn up by people who consider themselves to be neurodivergent. It was then called neurodiversity. So neurodivergent has evolved over language time. And as you can see, it talks about a number of difficulties. Now, this is a group of people who got together and talked about their experiences, what was common. And as you can see, they all overlap. And they say that when you have one diagnosis, you don't have one, you have an overlap with at least 3. So you can see the way they all overlap. Now, there are many other diagrams like this, devised by many people, but I try to stick to this because it is devised by the people with lived experience. So by all means, explore and have a look. The term neurodiversity was coined by Judy Singer in the 1990s. Oh, sorry, that was her book, if you can see that. There's a lot to learn about it, and it comes from biodiversity, so natural diversity in nature. Okay, this is a quick slide which you can see and forget afterwards because it's the medical model, but it's just about the positives. Now, not all neurodivergent people are famous. You don't know them all. They are everywhere, but there are a number of positive aspects that people perhaps don't talk about enough, including intelligence, empathy, visual memory, calm, and risk-taking. Now, risk-taking can be considered quite dangerous, but when it's calculated risk, it can be a good thing too. Lots of energy and commitment, so worth looking into. And now I'm going to talk about my lived experience. This is something I've only started talking about recently. I'm talking about two conditions that perhaps you don't hear of very much. I'm sure you've heard about autism and perhaps ADHD, maybe synesthesia, where the senses are mixed up. But here is one that perhaps you haven't heard of. It's called misophonia. It had a name in 2001. Okay, so it's estimated that 25% of the population have it. I've just been talking about the fight or flight reaction. This is a condition where a repetitive noise or light signal, so sensory issues, or tapping feet, something in your peripheral vision, keeps you in that fight, flight, or freeze zone. So if you hear a ticking clock, or you're on the tube and there's someone chewing gum right next to your ear, or making a persistent noise like sniffling, you kind of get into that anxiety, fear position. And you see my mouth is getting like talking about it. And it's difficult to get out. So I didn't know I had this. I've pretty much had it all my life. When the condition had a name, it was a great relief. And now I know what it is, and I've studied neuroscience. I know what's going on in my brain. I find that I can manage it really well. Okay, but you do have these feelings. This is an irreverent picture on my right. It does make you pretty angry in some situations. So please forget this picture. It's not PC. I'm using it because this is representative of the way I feel, and I would share it with people who have that condition. But yes, quite angry. And the other condition is PTSD. Now, again, I have been diagnosed with PTSD in the last 5 years. I didn't consider myself to be particularly in the fight flight area, and I hadn't had a what they call a panic attack, where fight flight really takes over and very short of breath and your cognition stops. And it was triggered first when I saw a hole kicked in the wall. Now, as a surveyor with 40 years experience, I've seen quite a few holes kicked in walls, I can tell you. And I was surprised that I had a panic attack for the first time. And I found out what it is. And through my neuroscience studies, I have discovered that when we have a trauma in our past, we have what they call a screen memory. So when our brains can't cope with the trauma, we pull a screen across with a different positive memory. And that blanks out the trauma until some point future in your life where you may have a trigger. That may be any sensory trigger. So if it's simple PTSD, the event that caused that episode has to be analysed with every sensory input. So you're looking at what was the temperature, now what was the season, was there a particular light coming in, who was there there music playing, was there a smell, anything in that sensory concoction may trigger that trauma, that episode again. And you have to talk about it. When it's a complex PTSD, that's related to a number of events, and obviously analysing all those sensory triggers is much more difficult. So, for instance, there's a picture of an open window there. The mind is organised into sections, and when you move from one area to another, a little bit of your memory is wiped out so that you can process the next room. So, for instance, if you're walking up the stairs and you forget your phone, you're going through event boundaries, which are doors and stairs and different rooms, and a little bit of your memory is wiped out. But also, when a window is open, your memory bank is open to other spaces. So you will find that, for instance, with military PTSD, an open window doesn't seal off the outside room and can cause a perception of trauma. So you need to be careful with things like this. And there are so many triggers that you couldn't be expected as a designer to look at them all, but I would say that long corridors are a particular thing. and the ability to create a quiet space where if there is a trauma trigger, you can go and relax and contemplate. That's really good. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight. And now we go on to the senses. Ooh, sight is very dominant. 50% of our brain processing area is taken up by vision. And the picture you see there is blood vessels in the eye, which our brains choose to ignore. When you go to an optician, the light is shone and you will see your blood vessels. So you know they're there, you can see them, but you choose to ignore it, and the brain chooses to ignore lots of things. Faces are the most difficult thing to see. And now we're going to do a little bit of a poll. And if I can ask for the poll to be prepared, what I'm going to ask you to do is focus on the black cross in the center of this image for 20 seconds and try not to look at the outside. And then in around 20 seconds, the poll questions will come up. And if I can ask you to put in your choice of 4 answers. Ooh, sorry, let me go back. Okay, so hopefully you've all had a chance to vote and there should be some results. That's the result I wanted. So the gap is moving, color changed, dots are moving. Right, so we have a variety of answers, and that's exactly what I was looking for. Given one image, we'll process, receive and output differently. So if I suggest things like the color green, you may see green. If I suggest movement, your brain may make it move. So vision and processing is very complex, but it's also very different for different people. And now, yes, there you go. So just another sense, only 1% of our brain is taken up by smell and taste processing, which might be surprised about. But because they are so simple and they are near the areas of the brain where processing happens, they recall memory faster. So if you try and think of a smell, your memory will be there straight away. So there are benefits to these senses, and of course they overlap. So there's a picture of a blurred car park there. And they say that if you park in a multi-story car park and you want to remember, then you try and put 3 senses in your brain. What did it smell like? What was the color of the car? What was the sound? And then you will recall the position you're parked in really quickly. So there are very many more than the standard 5 senses you're aware of, and the PAS introduces some new ones: movement, balance and interoception. So proprioception, interoception and equilibrioception are coming, but you can find the definition in the PAS. These are all senses that overlap with each other to varying degrees. So interesting point about this, we've moved towards open plan design, and perhaps you're aware that 46.9% of our time is spent with sensory distractions. So we're wasting nearly half of our time because things are disturbing us, might be noise or light. So when we're working from home in an open plan environment and there are other people around, your productivity might be different. And 66% of our processing goes in that way. So very briefly, I'll talk about PAS 6463. This is not a talk about PAS. It's heavily copyrighted and I'm not allowed to. So this is the front cover and some of the subjects. This is the best thing that's come out in 20 years in inclusion. I'd advise you all to have a look at it. It's free to download. As I say, you may struggle with a few new terms, but they are defined in the glossary there. So it deals with all these subjects, the definitions, really important. So we're all talking the same language, developing the brief, site layout, wayfinding, external spaces and access, internal layouts, MEP, acoustics and noise management, lighting and reflection, surface finishes, fixtures, fittings and furniture, and safety recovery and quiet spaces and environment type. So although they're the headings, there is a whole lot more in there. It's really, really worth a read. So there is a note in there, which I'll read out. An inclusive environment recognises and accommodates differences in the way people use the built environment. It facilitates dignified, equal and intuitive use by everyone. It does not physically or socially separate, and that's the really important part here, discriminate or isolate. It readily accommodates human diversity from childhood to adulthood through to old age, across all neurological profiles, abilities, impairments, and embraces every background, gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, or belief. Those are the protected characteristics in the Equality Act 2010. It helps people to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life. That's a really good definition of what we mean by inclusion, and encompasses everything in your life, not just physical barriers. So if you struggle to absorb the PAS information quickly, and I would say there is a lot of material, great material in there, which may take time to digest, then come back to the 3 principles they established. When you're designing, you should look for calm. You need a place for people to escape to chill out or to refresh, or when they're anxious or they have some sensory stimulation that they're not comfortable with, you can go to a room, and there are design principles set in there. Clarity, the picture there is of the London Underground font, which was developed specially for clarity, so that you have decision points and reassurance points, and everything is really easy to read, really clear, with a contrasted background, and it's acknowledged worldwide as being a really, really good font. So if you can aim for clarity in everything you design, that's great. It doesn't have to be loud or quiet, but you can design quiet and build in sensory stimulation later, because everybody either seeks or avoids sensory stimulation. So that's the best way to deal with it. And the final one is control. When we have choice and we have some control over our environment, it helps us to manage our own differences. So the picture there is of a heat map. I'll talk about temperature in a minute, so I won't go into that. But when we have a choice of sitting in an area with a different temperature, it helps very many things. But that is the same for air conditioning. Some people like breeze, some don't, and lighting. So, you know, put things on shorter circuits so that zones can have a little bit more control. So here's the temperature thing, thermal comfort. So the PAS 6463 talks about a good temperature between 19 and 23 degrees for passive occupancy. Now, some people will feel hot and some cold, as the image there shows. There's a man without a top on and a woman holding her cup very tightly because she feels cold. So at the same temperature, we may all feel different. The temperature set for offices is based on a 40-year-old 70-kilogram man back in the 1960s. And they estimate that women need 3 degrees more because they have lower metabolic rates to perform at the same rate. Some people believe there's an optimum temperature, others don't. So jury's out, but there's a lot of research. In the UK, the minimum UK legal temperature in an office is 16 degrees. At lower temperatures, I mean, the lower threshold would be 19 degrees. They say that alertness is best. At warmer temperatures of around 25 degrees, we have a lot of creative thinking happening and we make lower errors. For example, when we're typing, there's a 10% difference. And we are half as productive at 5 degrees less. Over 27 degrees, our neuroprocessing changes, and maths pretty much fails us. So the ambient temperature changes the way you think. And as I said, when there's a window open, there's a perception that there's a 3-degree difference in temperature. Whether it's actual or not, there's a perception in your brain. So if you can think about thermal comfort for everyone, it's difficult. Do you want everybody to be alert, productive, or creative? No, you want to have people toggling, because we function best when we toggle between functions. So you should have creative, alertness, performance, relaxation, and you should be able to move between those zones in an environment really easily for your best life. Okay, so think about open windows, creating maps of spaces that show temperatures so people know in advance, and whether there's a breeze or not, put in fans, open windows, make people aware when you design. Air quality is also important in that element, as is choice and the opportunity to escape to a calm room and toggling. And then just one more element before I wrap up for questions, patterns. Now, the way the brain processes lines and patterns is based on evolution. We are used to seeing what we call fractal patterns. So we're talking about trees, plants, clouds, waves, anything with a natural pattern is relaxing to our brain. Anything else, including lines, especially sharp ones, and unnatural things, makes our brain work overdrive, processing what the meaning is. So if you can bring in fractal patterns, and I don't just mean plants in the office, I mean shapes, natural curves that you see here, you can see that people are naturally drawn to a gap between the trees. This is a picture in Berlin, where people feel comforted by a little bit of shelter, even though the space is tight and some people are scrunched up. It's a nice, cool, warm, breezy space that suits a lot of people. And you'll see a lot of curves coming into buildings at the moment. We can bring this in lots of features. You can look at the manifestations on windows. Do they need to be sharp or regular? Can they be irregular? Can they be reads so that the brain sees the read, relates it to daylight and circadian rhythms, feels a sense of change through the day because the shade will change, and that's a connection back to nature, even though the area may be dark. So if you just have a look at these images for a moment, tell me which one you prefer. The zebra has natural lines and all the others are sharp and natural lines. I think I better move on because that affects a lot of people. So just to make the point that sharp and natural lines increase the gamma oscillations in your brain, give people migraines. So if you're looking at environments and you find people have migraines, doctor can't find out what it is, look at the sharp lines, try and change them for more natural lines, nature. When I discovered this, I stripped out all patterns and lines in my house, apart from fractal patterns, and the difference has been absolutely stunning. And everyone I mention it to finds that it works. So patterns, lines, color contrast, information, they all can give you sensory overload. Some people seek and some people avoid sensory stimulation. But if you have a bit of consistency and choice, so there's a consistent pattern in your design, but you can move between areas easily, that's great. Always remember, you're bringing in daylight and nature, you're going to have glare, and glare has been described in the PAS 6463 as disability, discomfort and reflection. It's worth having a really good look at that to find out how our visual perception changes that. And in the PAS, they talk about vivid versus muted colours. I understand it's difficult to find an expression for that, but vivid is obviously really bright, and muted doesn't mean boring and calm. It means that, you know, that you take it down a Pantone and there isn't so much contrast. And remember that if people seek or avoid color contrast and stimulation. If you make an environment calm, you can always add the vivid. People will bring their own version of vivid into that space, but you can't take it away. So here's a classic example of patterns. Hotels, no disrespect to hotels or public function areas, but there is a desire to add a bit of life and spice to carpets. Remember that you're moving across these corridors, and remember about trauma, and one of the biggest triggers is corridors. So already, but lines and patterns take a lot of processing when you're moving. They take a lot more. For people with vestibular differences, they can be really, really disturbing. So think about vivid while you're moving, if you can. Nearly there. When to involve a specialist? Obviously, I'd say every time you possibly can, because we have a wealth of knowledge and we can teach you tricks all the time about how we process information in our environment. But do it as early as possible, because once the design is set down, it's quite difficult for us to work with it. And we do work with post-occupancy situations, but they say that for every £1 spent on inclusion, when you're planning, it's equal to £1,000 in a retrofit. So think about any opportunity. It is a learning exercise. It's a really positive thing. It will enrich your designs, especially when it's appropriate. For specialist buildings, for instance, when you're designing for particular design for mental health, or perhaps an autism SEN school, then it's good to have specialist advice. And although inclusive designers will help you design for that condition, it will not only be that condition. So when you're designing with autism in mind, there's a wide spectrum to consider, and that spectrum is likely to change in users throughout its anticipated 100-year building life. But we also have to think about members of the public who come in. So there are specialist pockets of design in neurodiversity, such as autism and dementia, which we will all bring into the fold. If you're unsure or you need some reassurance, get a relationship with an inclusive designer, and that will build up your knowledge. You don't have to employ them all the time if there's a really sharp budget, but it is a learning process. If the client requests it, I'd always recommend that you contact an NROC member. The National Register of Access Consultants is a peer review group, the only profession. There are other people, of course, who practice as access consultants, particularly occupational therapists, but start at the Access Consultants Register because they've all been interviewed and peer reviewed. Okay, project briefing. It's final one. Refer to the PAS 6463. There's an RIBA plan of work setting out the neurodiversity implications at each stage. It's really helpful. Just have a quick checklist. Look for the design for your mind activities there. Assess the site context. We always think about people. I know you do too, but we think about a really wide variety of people who may or may not use the building, and demographics locally, and the life of the building. So consider that really carefully with us. The approach is really important. A lot of the reasons people don't use buildings is because they can't reach and leave and use the toilets, basically. So consider how you get there, what the catchment area is like, public transport. Topography, obviously we're talking about site changes, site level changes, but we can manage that really well if you consult us early on. And please try and consult and engage with people wherever you can. People who use the buildings have the best knowledge. The guidance and regulations are based on averages. It's constantly changing, and that's because we listen to people. So speak to people, they will come up with absolute gems in terms of design. And for existing buildings, you can have a sensory audit. We can do a range of things at your request. We don't have to come in and do planning or building control, access report. We can work with you on very minor or major issues. So look at all the RIBA stages from 0 to 7. Look at inclusive design requirements as living documents. They don't just sit on a piece of paper or get filed away. Try and identify a person who leads on inclusion. It's very important because when you make a small change, it can have a big impact on inclusion. So a Pantone here and a few degrees in gradient there can make the difference between getting there and not getting there. Try and embark on training and awareness. We pump out a lot of information as access consultants, and a lot of it's really interesting. Have a look at the design appraisal and review. The access strategy will take you all the way through the project and up to occupation and beyond, and you can build up on any obstacles you find, and it will give you an audit so that if there is a claim of discrimination in the Equality Act, you can use that as evidence of your decision-making process. Try and do a pre-occupancy and a post-occupancy consultation and audit, because that's the way you find out if things have really worked and you can work on things to improve. So just a few final images. Just wander around the environment and wonder how design is changing, how curves are coming in. This is the new Elizabeth line. And perhaps we've moved to a more gentler, calming design in a number of areas, and Transport for London were major sponsors of the PAS, so perhaps that's come out in their designs. And think about this as a final thought. If you are in nature, is that the only solution? This may be a beautiful design, very aspirational. Would you want to live there? So that's my talk for today. There are my contact details. As I say, I'm a safe place. If you want to contact me, I'm available on those details. And I can refer you on to any other information. I did promise books and I kind of forgotten. In terms of misophonia, there's a really good book on that. There's books on memory, 7 Sins of Memory, biophilic design, really complicated, but lots of images, which I know you love. There's the biophilic design by Collett and that's Medor, and Wilson is another one. And here's a beautiful book just to take you back into the biophilic on tree houses of the world. Absolute favorite. If you're designing buildings, there's some outside space. Tree houses are brilliant as calm rooms. Real experience in nature. And here's a favorite one just to keep you going. Neuroscience. Swearing is good for you. It's a fact. So enjoy the neuroscience. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them, and I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you, Helen. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. I can see we haven't got any questions just yet, but if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And yeah, I found that really interesting. Thank you. It's funny, I've never thought about it before, but I have quite often found hotel corridors really quite overwhelming. I now know why.
Yes, and they change all the time, don't they? It's not just one pattern.
Yeah.
You come out of your room, you go to the lift and there's another pattern. And yeah, I kind of understand the reasoning for it, and patterns disguise dirt. But if you're in a hotel, you kind of want to relax. So stressing your brain out, maybe have a rethink.
Yeah. We still don't have any questions just yet. Which perhaps just means, we have a couple in the chat. So Jackie has asked, have you any advice on lighting levels for neurodiversity?
Yes, there are technical recommendations in the PAS. Again, it's heavily copyrighted. I won't talk about that. But the one thing I would say is make them flexible, because everyone perceives light differently. Everyone needs a different level of light. You know, I'm getting to the age where I need more light because my eye perception is changing. Put choice in. So if you can have dimmer controls wherever possible, and a range of lights, so you might have overhead lights, task lighting, to increase lighting so that everybody has a bit of an option. Lots of other things to do with lighting that I could talk to you about, but that's kind of another hour's talk in itself. So if you want me to refer you to the technical advice, please contact me.
Great, thank you. And we've got another question in the Q&A from Nicola, who's asked whether you have any thoughts on textures within design as well.
Yep, textures are really important. It kind of goes with the seek or avoid stimulation. Touch is one of the senses that comes into play in a multi-sensory design. Softer textures can be really comforting. For some people, harder textures are also reassuring. There's a perception of cleanliness. So there should be a mix, but generally when we see softer textures, it makes us calmer, and of course softer textures absorb sound better, so that when you're moving through a space, even seeing, you know, a soft rug or an upholstered chair can make you feel more relaxed, because you know the sound will be absorbed. So again, there's a whole section on textures in the PAS, which are really good to read. But ask people, you know.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any other questions from anybody? Don't seem to have any coming in. One quick one from me, and do excuse me if it's a slightly silly question because I'm not a designer myself, I'm an events professional, but I was interested when you were talking about the open plan design, and you mentioned about overwhelmed senses kind of reducing productivity essentially. I wondered, are there ways that you can work within an open plan space and design an open plan space to best promote people living well or working well within them?
Yes, divide the space up into manageable segments. So if you speak to people, you can draw out what makes them feel more comfortable or perform better or focus. You can have sections which are open plan, because some people do want to collaborate and hear the noises around them, and you know, they're processed while you're working. But you might also want some booth seats with a fabric cover, and the covers that I noticed are increasing in height. So that you used to have them up to here, but there was still a perception that sound and light travels over. So some of them are taller, and some single and some in groups, so that you can perform different functions. But have a kind of open plan with a view of different areas. So you can do that toggling that's so important for our brain. So you move between functions, and you know at any point you can go to another area. So when you're really struggling to focus on a report, you can see in your peripheral vision that there's a quiet room, and you kind of tell yourself, I'm going to reward myself by going sitting there for a minute when I've achieved my target. It just makes your brain work really, really well.
Thank you, that's really interesting. I'm not seeing any more questions coming up in the chat or the Q&A. If we maybe give it another minute or so that anyone that does have any questions can get in touch. Oh, we've just had another one come in. So yep. Have you seen that?
I have.
Brilliant.
Yes, yes, there are particular design considerations to take into account in autism, and schools are trying to move towards being more aware. Awareness is a really big thing. I can refer you to some design recommendations. It's a particularly evolving skill to design for that. And contact me separately and I'll give you some more specific leads. But also remember that the school environment has to cater for everyone. So there are lots of design guides out there. Building bulletins will help you with a few of those on the general inclusion, and then you can add on the paths. But being aware of the way the environment impacts is also important too, because some people have to adjust their personal environment as well as the general environment. So there's lots of reading and learning to do that. But yes, if people were more aware, it would be less of a barrier.
Thank you. And we've also had a question in the Q&A asking about, have you got any thoughts regarding interacting with technology?
Yeah, there's some great technology out there. So there's wayfinding technology being developed where you can scan a barcode or a QR code to move around and to receive information. And there are obviously smart technology is out there and developing all the time. So in terms of having choice and flexibility, that's really good. So you can adjust lighting levels on zones and bring on task lighting. Yeah, I would love to have more technology around me, but it's a matter of understanding how far it can go, and also that not everyone can use technology. So if people have a particularly sensory difference, you can't exclude them from participation. So, you know, even such things as vending machines can be operated from an app these days. You don't have to walk up to a screen and find your drink or your snack. So there's lots of technology out there. But again, another lecture in itself.
Thank you. Unless we've got any more questions that anyone has to send in, I think we're coming towards the end of our time. So I can't see any more questions. Helen, thank you so much for your talk. This has been really, really interesting. Thank you for the time. Thank you for everyone that's joined us today as well.
Welcome. If anyone wants to contact me afterwards, please do so, all in confidence.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoys the last couple of sessions today, and we'll see you soon. Thank you again, Helen.
Okay, bye.